as the United States gets ready to slash its aid budget, as European politicians clamor against the threat of uncontrolled migration. Elsewhere, famine is brewing, and it's man-made. Up to 20 million face starvation in Yemen, Somalia, South Sudan, and northeast Nigeria. Now, each case is different, but they have this in common: conflict, the breakdown of public services, and in the case of South Sudan, a leaked UN report squarely accuses the government of withholding food to opposition-dominated areas. Donor drives alone won't solve the mess in Africa's newest nation, an oil-rich country whose creation was encouraged by the West. Now, we can argue about who bears the responsibility, but first, it's about saving lives. How do you break the cycle that, in the case of Somalia, has endured for more than a quarter century? How to stop the war in Yemen? Can there be a holistic plan that makes these nations more self-reliant? Ethiopia would argue, yes, it managed to stave off starvation this time. And while there's plenty to criticize about the regime in Addis Ababa, the country has proven that where there's the political will, famine can be avoided. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at famine as a weapon of war. And joining us here in the studio, we're pleased to welcome, he is Somalia's ambassador to France, Ali Sharif Ahmed. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks as well to former Chadian Foreign Minister and UN Ambassador Ashek Ibn Umar. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me again.
Joining us from the Ethiopian capital, Alex Duval of Tufts University's Fletcher School. Thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
And France 24 correspondent Simona Fulton back in Dubai after shooting a report in South Sudan. Nice to see you, Simona.
Good evening.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. It's being called the world's largest humanitarian crisis in 70 years. As a map of Africa shows, the drought this year affecting all nations from Senegal to the Arabian Peninsula. For example, the Red Cross now says the number of Kenyans needing emergency food aid has doubled in the past 3 months to 3 million. I'll begin with you, Alex Duval. We see that in the case of what's going on, climate is part of the reason. How much, if you were to give proportionally to say, when we speak about those four nations we mentioned at the outset, how much do you blame climate for all of this?
I blame climate very little. And in fact, I would preface that by saying that when the head of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Stephen O'Brien, speaking to the UN Security Council about 10 days ago, described this as the worst humanitarian crisis since the UN was created, that was hyperbolic. It is bad. It's the worst for at least 5 years, possibly the worst for 20 years. But in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, millions or tens of millions of people used to die from famine. The last 30 years is that number's been brought down by an order of magnitude. We no longer see famines of that order of magnitude in the world. Now, that decline was brought was engineered by a number of technical improvements, better markets, better public health, etc., the growth of the humanitarian system, but also by better politics, a much more responsive national and international political system, and the decline in wars. We have actually many fewer wars. Now, the last few years, we've seen that very impressive achievement stall and begin to go into reverse. We see wars spreading. We see this terrible civil war in South Sudan. We see the biggest famine, which is in Yemen, being brought about entirely by the war fought by Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Cooperation Council against the Houthis, using embargo and food as a weapon of war. And primarily it is the politics, the readiness of political leaders to use food and the destruction of livelihoods as a weapon of war that is responsible for what we're seeing today.
Ambassador Ahmed, let me ask your reaction to what Alex Duval just said, because, for instance, in your country, we've seen at the same time institutions bolstered, recently the election of a new president. On the other hand, Shabab militias haven't gone away. We're still seeing suicide attacks in the capital, Mogadishu, and we're seeing an acute problem in places like Baidoa right now, where the people are on the brink of starvation.
Well, absolutely it is. I mean, the state institution has been improving, as you say, for basically for the last 6 years, which just came out of an election, which was really a long campaign, but eventually a smooth transition of powers. But what it is not only Al-Shabaab, but also the rain season has been really very late, and not only very late for this year, but for 3 years, some part of the country, they didn't have a consistent rain that, basically. So we've got this very gradual, and it's the delay of rain, and also and harvest, and the river is drying up, particularly in the southern side of the country. And combined with that, conflict, which basically prevents some of the areas that needs to be attended by the aid agencies inaccessible to aid agencies to go and then to feed needy people until such a time that things get really very in a crisis management as we are in at the moment.
Yeah, because Somalia dependent on, aid is just something that's factored in if you want to feed everybody in Somalia.
Well, yes, the Somali dependence on farming and livestock. And because there is no rain that comes, and it was impossible to farm, and it was also animals are dying because there is no rain and water for them to drink. So it become, it's literally evidence of starvation, and people moving from where they were to whoever going to the cities, big cities, and being IDBs in the peoples in big cities, in the regions, and also in the capital.
All right,
Mogadishu,
that's the situation in Somalia.
That is in the situation of Somalia. The government have set up a committee and drought response committee in December last year, who's chaired by the Prime Minister, coordinating with the international aid agencies and also Somalis, whether inside the country and diaspora, and they're doing a lot of work in order to respond within their ability to this tragic event.
All right, let's talk about what's going on in South Sudan. It's Africa's newest nation. Fighters there have, in some cases, turned on those who distribute the aid. The latest example, 6 employees of a UN-affiliated group, Grassroots Empowerment and Development Organization. They appear to have been summarily executed after an ambush on the road from the capital, Juba, towards the town of Pibor, an area that's mostly under government control, but with many local militias. The victims, Kenyans and South Sudanese, it brings to 79 aid workers killed since the fighting broke out along mostly ethnic lines between President Salva Kiir's government forces and those of Riek Machar in December of 2013. Let me ask you, Simona Fulton, this latest killing of aid workers, is that going to be a further hindrance to the distribution of much needed food aid, and who is to blame for it?
Well, it is the deadliest attack on aid workers since the onset of the conflict. But as you already mentioned, 79 aid workers have been killed so far. So unfortunately, this has been the norm. It's not only attacks on aid workers that have hampered the aid delivery. You have frequent looting of aid supplies that obviously are a huge setback for aid operations. And then you have, the just daily negotiations to get access to areas, whether it's controlled by the government or controlled by the rebels, but especially areas that are controlled by government have been really difficult to access, which is basically why we are seeing famine in some parts of South Sudan.
Why are the government areas harder to access than the rebel-held areas?
So the government has been obstructing aid. The UN has said this recently very clearly, because basically it's seen as a deliberate strategy to starve civilians that are perceived to be sympathetic to the rebels. So while the government a lot of times calls upon the UN and aid agencies to deliver aid to citizens which are sympathetic to the government, it a lot of times delays, for example, flight assurances to areas that are controlled by the rebels, or sometimes you will see that the government in Juba may grant the permissions, but then the aid agencies arrive on the ground and then whoever is in charge there simply denies the permissions and doesn't respect those.
All right, let's hear what the government has to say about this. They deny responsibility for the killing of those 6 aid workers.
For those unfortunate workers who have died, the government does not have a policy of killing humanitarian agencies. And I'm sorry to say that sometimes it is said the government takes responsibility. I'm not hearing people saying rebels and gangs, armed gangs on the streets and the roads and highways of South Sudan should take responsibility and should be declared by the AU as negative forces so that they are pursued both regionally and internationally. Because negative forces exist everywhere in the world. I don't know why they're not declared in South Sudan.
Let's go now to South Sudan's capital and say hello to rapper and hip-hop artist Lual Dawal. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Thanks for having me.
What's your reaction to what you just heard that government minister say, that they're not responsible?
Well, to be honest with you, I will not blame the government. I really put the blame on, vigilante people on the streets, robbing people. And at the end of the day, all the blame is always going to go on the government. But, the government are trying. It's not like they're not trying. They're trying. And I've been a critical government in the past. But I've learned that at least they're trying. And it's a new nation. It's not like all the other countries where they have just been formed recently. I mean, this is it's like taking baby steps. You have to walk before you can fly. So that's what I can say when it comes to the blame always being put on the government for everything that goes wrong in the country. But I don't think that's the case.
All right, Lual, we're going to have to leave you because the connection is a little bit poor, but I want to get the reaction of Alex Duval to what you just said. Basically, we heard Lual Dawal say you can't put all the blame at the foot of the government in Juba. What's your reaction?
Well, I think we can put most of the blame on the doorstep of the government in Juba. The idea that South Sudan is an infant government, one just only able to take baby steps, I don't think that can excuse the government from inflicting the kinds of extraordinarily violent attacks on civilians, because it's not just crimes of obstructing relief, it's crimes of burning villages, driving people from their homes, stealing land, killing many people that have been perpetrated by government forces, and not just by government forces. But the fact that the opposition forces are also guilty of these crimes does not make the government any less guilty. And I think it's one of the things that will have to happen as this conflict comes to an end in South Sudan, we hope soon. Not only will there have to be accountability for crimes against humanity, mass atrocities, but also for famine crimes, the crimes that cause people to starve in South Sudan. There can be no excuse for this.
No excuse, and we heard some blunt words last week from the new UN Secretary General, bluntly accusing South Sudan's president of obstructing peace and reconciliation.
President Kiir's statements regarding his intention to hold a national dialogue are welcome. They are not convincing in the context of ongoing hostilities, the absence of consultation with key stakeholders, the systematic curtailment of basic political freedoms and restrictions on humanitarian access, and the growing fragmentation of both sides of the conflict.
What's your reaction to that, Ashekin Lumar, hearing the new UN Secretary General saying that, well, the words of South Sudan's president are not convincing?
Well, it is quite new because, in the United Nations and the African Union, there is this diplomatic language that lead the people in charge to, be some kind of soft on the sitting head of state. I think I don't know what is going on the ground, but I think it is a good move, to call a spade when people lives and survival is at stake. I think it is a good move. But talking of South Sudan, I think the term government is a misnomer. Because when you look at the forces fighting with each other, there is no difference between the so-called governmental forces and the rebels, because the same kind of militia, the same kind of ethnic motivations, the same kind of behavior toward the civilian and so on. It is difficult, to draw a separate line between the governmental forces and the rebel ones. So the picture is very confused, and it needs a very strong leadership on all the sides, to move forward.
Ambassador, did Antonio Guterres strike the right tone in his remarks?
Well, I think the situation in Sudan, like the most of the regions, is a very an unfortunate problem in the continent, and the African Union, and also particularly in the IGAD, they've been trying really to mediate and conflicting parties in the country to come sort of.
They've been mediating a long time.
They've mediated in a long time. I think and with the lead of IGAD and African Union, and help with the international community like United Nations, I think some sort of peace and settlement could be.
Are you saying that there still could be a middle ground? We're going to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.